Hello everyone. Kenyo and Nopti and Mew and K-chan and Boki. And thank you K-chan for the donation to the Trevor project. But yes, I am a cyborg, not a robot. There's a difference. And yeah, there was the content warning for the book. There's a lot of bad stuff that happens in this book apparently. Okay, Nopti, have a good lurk. Yeah, but have you not seen my chibi, Mew? Oh, I thought you had been to one of the reading streams. I've been using the chibi since I've been doing the reading. I thought you had been to at least one of the reading streams before now. Yeah, I like the chibi. It's cute. Oh, well, yes, I am Chibi Chico. Oh, I forgot to get my book. I would probably fit on your shoulder in this form. I'm small. Okay, Mew. Why don't you just come do that now? That sounds like fun. So yeah, we're probably gonna read 2 chapters today since I didn't read yesterday. Apparently you're gonna have to fight me over it. Of who gets to pick me up first. I don't know why my mouth was open there for a second. And what? What's the rest of that, Kenyo? I am? K-chan, how am I in your arms? It doesn't look like you're carrying me right now. Yeah, just say him anyway, Kenyo. It's fine. I'm sure it's fine. Okay, Mew. Yeah, I like Mew's idea. That's fine. Alright, we're on chapter 5, which is still in Arlo's POV, apparently. Yeah, that's fine, Kenyo. Kenyo, you know I've told you that you can kiss me whenever and wherever. So, that's up to you. Instead of puff puff pass, it's moi moi pass. We can do both those things. That sounds like fun. Play puff puff moi moi pass at the same time. Okay, I'm gonna actually start reading now. Tucked away in a crowded strip of office buildings, clothing boutiques, and numerous ethnic restaurants, Good Vibes Only was an innocuous slip of dark red brick and faded silver lettering, barely noticeable to human passerbys. By judging by the obviously human couple who just left through the glass front door, it was not entirely concealed from detection. Fairy cafes were an increasingly popular trend in the courts. The common folk, fairies and Ironborn, weren't quite as restricted in their relationships with humans as the Fae were, but it was still the law that no one outside of the magical community could know about the court's existence without their court's approval. This meant that sometimes fairies needed somewhere they could go to unwind without fear of discovery, and rather than exhaust themselves on erasing such places altogether, the folk had come up with a trendy alternative. When Arlo and her father entered Good Vibes Only, it had taken little effort to sense the many auras perfuming the air. It was far beyond Arlo's current ability to separate one from the other in this sort of setting. The effect a bit like stepping inside a scented candle shop, but not as overwhelming as she'd feared it would be. For a human, Arlo's father had quite the ability to pick out magic around him, drawn like a moth to its beckoning flame. Coincidence, most likely, though she supposed it was possible he had a relative somewhere back in his line who was one of the folk, which would explain why he'd been initially drawn to Arlo's mother, and why Arlo's own ability to detect magic was stronger than so many other Fae. So, Rory hedged when they were halfway through their meal. He was partially absorbed in sopping up the innards of his burrito with a corner of its soft shell, but as he spoke, he shot a glance across the table at Arlo. "Have you made up your mind about school?" And here it was, the talk. "Not really, no," Arlo sighed. I know, you were hoping for a better answer. We've already paid the university an acceptance deposit, and I get it, but honestly, I just don't know if I want to go." She leaned back in her chair, dropping her fork to her plate. "I mean, I'm super grateful that U of T accepted me into their arts program, but what am I even going to do? I don't have the brains for science like you. I can't take your biochemistry classes, and everyone has an English degree." She'd only really applied to university because she'd wanted to make sure she had something going for her if the Fae High Council rejected her status altogether. The Toronto Fae Academy, better known as the TFA, or TIFA for short, where Arlo's weighing had taken place, was empathetically not on the list of Arlo's options. Once upon a time, simply being Ironborn would have guaranteed Arlo's placement there. Their magic was different, was more than the illusions and command of the elements that the Fae and fairies practice. Witches, wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, Ironborn had been called many things over the ages. But what they were alchemists. Their talent was that of blending the ancient runes of old magic and the chemical formulas of science into intricate arrays, which helped them to do all sorts of things, like cast spells and enchant items and brew potions. Arlo had no idea why only the Ironborn could do this, why those chemical formulas refused to cooperate with magic unless iron blood was present to ground it. She would never know why, but all she was permitted to learn now about the art was that centuries ago, an Ironborn had tried to use alchemy to make themselves greater than the courts, and the price of such arrogance had been devastating. Lives had been lost, and their secrecy had nearly been blown. After this, the High Council had determined alchemy too dangerous for continued practice and imposed tighter restrictions on the Ironborn community as a whole in consequence. Now the art was outright forbidden, and Arlo would have better luck applying to Starfleet Academy for an education, because the TFA taught Fae and no one else. I was thinking that I could put off this decision for a year or so, travel, like some of the others at school are doing, or maybe pick up some more work here, because going off someplace where I don't know anyone who could help me if something happened, it was terrifying even to contemplate. University seemed like the safest and most obvious solution, and the one both her parents wanted her to choose. But that had been before the weighing, when Arlo had still been content with her fairy status. Ever since, in spite of all her lingering hesitancies and doubts, she'd started giving thought to the things that she wanted, neither safe nor practical. The council conceding that she could still become a full-fledged Fae, however condescendingly, made it impossible for her to shake hoping for the same. It blossomed inside her, pushing her toward something more. But it wasn't like she could explain the depth of her indecision to her father, as much as she wished she could. Sighing, Rory placed his latte on the table. It's fair, Arlo. It's a lot, I know, and in the end, it's your decision. I just don't understand why you don't want to go. It's all right to be scared. Nobody knows what they want in life when they're your age. The world's a confusing place, but that doesn't mean you just lay yourself down on the tracks and wait for inspiration to hit you. That's a really morbid metaphor. Thanks, Dad. I know you're worried about doing the right thing, and for whatever reason you feel like university might not be it, but sometimes you don't figure out what you want until you're right in the thick of it. Your tuition is free since I work at the school, so if you did change your mind, all you'd be owing is what you took out on loan for staying in residence. And even that you could avoid by staying with either myself or your mother, he added meaningfully. I know, Arlo sighed again. Some of her father's frustration was actually just his own hope that she'd come live with him during her undergraduate career. She was grateful he seemed to realize there was something beyond teenage theatrics holding her back, but not for the first time. Arlo wondered what her life would be like if her father had never forfeited his knowledge of magic. If she could actually confide in him, play the role of the child she was instead of the parent she needed to be to protect him. I know, it's not that I don't want to go to school at all. Arlo going off to school was just about the only thing that her parents agreed on anymore. Thallo, enchanted by the human way of life, so much so that it was what had driven her to take one for her husband, wanted Arlo to go to university. Arlo had a feeling this insistence was her mother's regret that she'd never been able to go herself. Rory wanted Arlo to get a higher education, blissfully unaware of the life his daughter lived away from his human gaze. School to him meant a job and security and lifelong friendships that would help her discover what she wanted from what he saw as an uncomplicated future. Flicking her eyes away from their table in an attempt to find a change of topic, Arlo surveyed the cafe and its patrons. The quaint little space was crammed with cherry-stained tables, matching chairs upholstered in floral print, and scenic oil paintings hanging on the red brick walls. On a counter laden with cake plates and fancy bow jars full of pastries was a stack of pamphlets enchanted for human senses to read about some upcoming festival on the Danforth, but were actually the latest in assistance news. Not exactly illegal, freedom of speech was just as much a right in the courts as it was in this part of the human world, but a surprisingly bold move nonetheless. The Good Vibes Only employees were going to be in for quite the interrogation once the courts found out these were here and would be on very close watch here on out. Beside their table sat a small family, mother and father both engrossed in a phone that they held between them. The pair reminisced over photos while their preteen daughter chased ketchup around her plate with her fries. She was completely disinterested in the phone whenever her mother held it out for her inspection, and in Arlo's opinion looked like she wasn't enjoying herself much at all. Further on and seated by the window at the front of the cafe were two young human men in a great deal of brightly colored spandex, helmets hanging off their chairs. At the table beside them was a group of women in expensive jogging gear, happily chatting away over their lattes. At least one of them was fairy. Arlo could tell by the concentration of aura around the group, but with Arlo's sight not as strong as it should be, she'd never be able to tell which of them it was, or even what kind of fairy they were. And that was the real draw of fairy cafes. The folk didn't come to places like this for the energy found in caffeine. They came to recharge their glamours. With the cafe's well-trained staff suffusing the air with as much of their magic as possible, no human patron would notice folk around them easing up on their own disguise. Weary members of the magical community could pop into a cafe, rest without having to retreat to their homes, and absorb a bit of the magic that was freely given. Upon their leave, they'd feel as refreshed as they had at the start of the day, and the staff were paid extremely well for this service, funded by the courts themselves. Despite her curiosity regarding this fairy jogger, Arlo allowed her gaze to continue to drift around the room. She tried her best to divide her attention between her perusal and the story that had taken up their conversation now, her father's move to Canada, which she'd heard numerous times before. So I get why you feel that way. I mean, I moved all the way across the North Atlantic Ocean when I married your mother. It was frightening as all hell. I didn't know a single person here, but I was very taken with Thallo, and she was pregnant with you, and... It was the girl in the far corner who next snagged Arlo's attention, although at first Arlo couldn't say why. 2 seats down from the chatty joggers, this new source of interest was casually folded against the back of her chair, but her nonchalant posture was incongruous with the rapt attention she focused on the family next to Arlo. The girl was all alone with nothing but her latte and sandwich, and by the looks of things, somewhere around Arlo's age, if just a little older. The way she dressed wasn't anything unusual for city fashion, but it gave her the appearance of someone who kept rough company. With the girl's black skinny jeans, black leather boots, and equally black leather jacket, thrown over a simple tank top and yet more black, part of Arlo wanted to write her off as the sort she went to school with, the ones who smoked in the drama wing bathrooms and pierced their own ears with the backs of pens. The cool girls. Arlo had never fit in with them, even when the kids her age hadn't actively ignored her. Not that she'd ever really fit in with any crowd, but her spectacular inability to push boundaries made her woefully ill-suited to that one in particular. Instinct urged her to look away, but the intense way this girl stared at that family, was she planning on mugging them or something? It wasn't any of Arlo's business. What could she do besides? Give the family a heads up? Tell them the girl in the corner looked like a shady character, and they had better keep an eye on their possessions? Most likely she was completely harmless, and all Arlo would end up doing was cause problems where there were none before. I mean, piercing your ears is painful in general. But yeah, when you do it yourself, it does sound painful. I looked away from the book for a second and lost where I was. Really, she should just look away, but there was something so off about her. Honestly, it felt a bit like waking from a dream and falling straight into cold, hard reality. But I had my job, and I had my friends, and I had you, and life was going to carry on whether I wanted it to or not. So I told myself, Rory, you can't just sit around feeling sorry for yourself. You either shit or get off the... The longer Arlo looked, the harder it became to look away, and the more she was convinced that the girl in the corner was more than what she seemed. Was she fairy? Unlike the girls at her school who'd done a good job at playing tough and dangerous, there was an air about this one that said she was no act. It was all in the way she held herself, that casual grace. She was pretty well covered and obstructed by her table, but there was strength at rest in her long body, and all that black seemed like snakeskin stretched over pure muscle. Most concerning were her eyes. Okay, Sean, you don't want to get your ears pierced? It's honestly not that painful. Like, it just feels like a pinch for a second. Her outward appearance was sun-bronzed skin and pale sand hair gathered messily behind her head. Her face was an armory of sharp features and deadly edges. Her steel-gray eyes were bright as the glittering points of daggers. Too bright. Something flexed behind them, a shadow of something Arlo couldn't quite make out, but it was there. Her magical signature was not. This girl was strong, and she was beautiful, and most of all she was frightening, but Arlo could detect nothing about her to mark her as anything other than human. Was her magic simply too weak to stand out against everything else in the cafe? Arlo began to focus her sight once more, probing for even a trace of magic, or that had been the intention, until the girl finally realized she was now the subject of someone's attention. Steel eyes slid to Arlo. Well, of course it's painful, K-chan, but I mean, it's not that painful. Miu, you don't want to get your ears pierced either? Just don't go to Claire's. Go to an actual tattoo piercing shop. The glare the girl narrowed in Arlo's direction made Arlo recoil violently. Pressure exploded behind her eyes as deadly pain blossomed in her stomach, and her vision splintered momentarily into darkness. Arlo, Roy gasped. Hey, are you alright? What's wrong? His hands flew up out to steady the drink that Arlo's alarm had almost knocked over. She stared at her father, blinking through her daze, trying to comprehend his simple question. At the same time, her hand slid over her stomach, and she was genuinely surprised when it didn't come away red. She could almost swear she'd been stabbed through the gut, that she was hurt, and badly, yet all was well. The pain had faded as quickly as it had been inflicted. A few red hairs were out of place thanks to her inexplicable spasm of horror, and neither her jeans nor the white t-shirt under her cardigan showed any sign of a wound. She was fine. Had what Arlo felt been the girl's aura? Impossible. She had never felt an aura that fiercely. Arlo's mind was playing tricks on her. How much caffeine was in her drink? Frowning at her cup, she apologized with the lie. Sorry, I'm fine. I spaced out there for a second. Something touched my leg and it startled me. Rory allowed his daughter's weird behavior to slide with nothing more than a quick quirk of his brow. Before Arlo could stop herself, she shot another glance over her father's shoulder at the girl who might have just tried to murder her with a glare. If that hadn't been in Arlo's imagination, was that girl fixing the same strange power on the family she'd been watching? That preteen girl at the table beside her. Was that the reason why she looked so distinctly uncomfortable? The girl in the corner wasn't looking at Arlo now. She'd gone back to watching the family as they packed up their belongings. Her brow started to cave under what looked a lot like concern, curiosity. It was hard to tell. You don't seem too interested in your meal. Are you ready to go then? Huh? Arlo turned her attention back to her father. Sorry, not really hungry today, I guess. We can go, yeah? Told you, I'm not feeling well, the preteen girl complained, stealing Arlo's focus once more. Her words were an understatement. She didn't look like she was feeling well at all. She'd begun to sweat and was now turning an alarming shade of white. Hunched in her seat, she'd abandoned her fries in favor of rubbing her chest and was much worse off than she'd been a moment ago, to the point where Arlo wondered if she was going to vomit on the floor between them. Cassandra, honey, honestly. Carl, she really doesn't look well. Maybe we should go back to the hotel and just relax for the rest of the day. She's been complaining this whole trip, Chloe. Just because this isn't Palm Springs doesn't mean she can't enjoy herself. God forbid. Listen, Cassie, you really need to stop this. You never listen to me, Cassandra cried. Her words started to slur together, and genuine tears began to streak down her far too pale face. I'm not feeling well. My chest hurts. I want to go home, she groaned, then fisting the fabric of her shirt. I'm going to be sick. You're making yourself sick. Carl, Arlo, are you listening to me? What the? Arlo gasped, shooting straight up in her seat as something very strange began happening with the girl, Cassandra. At the same time, Cassandra doubled over. She stammered through what sounded like a firmly clenched jaw, right until she threw up on the ground and proceeded to collapse. Her mother's chair clattered to the floor as she flew to her daughter's aid. Cassandra! Arlo could only stare, eyes wide. It wasn't Cassandra vomiting that had her so entranced. It was the way the blood in her veins had started to glow as bright as and ruby red as a traffic light. What the hell is that? Arlo marveled under her breath, rising slowly to her feet. Cassandra's frantic parents were now both huddled around their daughter and calling for help. They were nowhere near as concerned as they should be about their daughter's unusual glowing, almost as though they couldn't see it at all. Instinct kicked in once more. Arlo's gaze drifted away from the family, away from the staff now rushing over, away from the stunned onlookers, whose faces were slowly crumbling in horror as they picked up words like not breathing and no pulse, and over to the girl in the corner. The girl sat statue still, watching as one of the employees carefully stretched Cassandra out on the floor so they could administer CPR. She was watching like this was all to be expected, like this was just the next step in some horrendous plan, and everything was going accordingly. Hey, Arlo growled, suddenly too angry to be surprised by her own boldness. You. Oblivious to her shouting, Rory launched from his chair, deftly circumventing the table to pull Arlo aside. His focus was solely on clearing space for the family and those attempting to help the girl on the floor. The faint call of sirens began to sound in the distance. Someone had summoned an ambulance, and it drew closer by the second. The fairy in the group of joggers was now identifiable, the only one looking on in something of bemused interest, more fascinated by the spectacle than horrified by some random human death. But one of her companions, a nurse she declared herself, came out of her shock to join the staff on the floor with Cassandra. There was already enough commotion without Arlo shouting across the room at callous strangers, and it wouldn't help anything besides. But she succeeded in drawing the girl's attention once again. This time Arlo was the one to wield a glare. Already the glow in Cassandra's body began to dim. Arlo had never encountered magic like this before, but the girl in black. Arlo was willing to bet everything that she had something to do with this. In the very least, she knew more than anyone else here about what was going on, and that was enough to make Arlo suspicious. Even if this girl wasn't the reason for this turn of events, she'd done nothing to try to prevent this. She'd known something was wrong. Why else would she have been staring so hard at them? And now her mother was kneeling in hysterics on the floor, begging her too still daughter to open your eyes, sweetie, please. The paramedics finally arrived, bursting in through the front door and ushering everyone further away. It was only because Arlo had been watching the possible culprit instead of Cassandra that she saw her try to slip away, to make for the cafe's entrance and use the commotion as cover for her flight. "It's all right," Rory whispered, misreading Arlo's agitation and drawing her closer. He dropped a kiss against her hair without looking. His attention was fixed on Cassandra, now being lifted onto a stretcher. "It's all right, everything's okay." A lie. For Cassandra, everything wasn't going to be okay. Arlo didn't need the shell-shocked mother and father, or the grim-faced paramedics to tell her that little girl was dead. The glow that had started to dim in her veins had died off completely, even before they could cover her body and hurry her out to the waiting ambulance. Arlo didn't need an official proclamation to know what that meant. She pulled away and ran, without thinking. It was the only explanation for the burst of bravery that set her off after the girl in black. "Arlo," her father called. "What are you doing?" "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand back, please." "But my daughter, Arlo." Arlo burst out of the Good Vibes Only cafe and looked around wildly. "Hey, you, stop." The girl in black had made it far enough down the street that she could have pretended not to hear her. Already at the curb of the crosswalk that separated this block from the next, she could have escaped quite easily, even with Arlo rushing after her. But for some reason, she chose instead to freeze. Arlo didn't question it. Her outrage propelled her forward, distracting her from now terribly uncomfortable she usually was with confrontation. "What did you do?" Arlo shouted, the accusation whipping around like a storm inside her. She caught up at last. With no real idea what to do next, Arlo did the first thing adrenaline suggested. She reached out and snatched the girl's arm, tugging the girl around to face her. "Excuse me." Whatever tension had been in the girl relaxed into threatening poise. She glared down at Arlo, those gray eyes even sharper now that Arlo was close enough to count the barely there freckles on her tanned face. She wasn't human. Arlo could finally say that for certain. What she was a little more ambiguous, but there was just enough otherworldly keenness lurking beneath her human guise to give her away. It infuriated Arlo that she couldn't help but note the girl was even more beautiful up close. And that painful sensation she'd felt in the cafe, it was the girl's magic. She could feel it better now. 2 auras in one day. Arlo didn't know what to make of this startling progression of her ability to physically feel magic. But this aura was different from the one she'd felt earlier before entering the cafe. This one was violent, angry, and writhing and hot. It smelled like wood smoke and metal, not rotting flowers, and lashed out at Arlo the very moment her own tried to brush against it. She almost recoiled. She would have, except something in the girl's glare seemed to want that, and Arlo could be just as obstinate as the Fae in her family when she was in a mood. "I said, what did you do to that girl?" Bold assumption, Red. "Listen, is this all you wanted? Because I'm a little busy at the moment. I don't have time to play another round of pine the blame on the Dark Star today." The Dark Star. What? The girl in black sneered. She allowed Arlo to keep her hold on her right arm, but with her left reached up to tug aside the collar of her jacket. Arlo's eyes widened. There on the hollow of her neck was the tattoo of a great black star, and she immediately knew what it meant, even though she'd never seen it with her own eyes before this moment, and all she had to base her conclusions on were rumors. Arlo dropped her hand. There wasn't much known about the Dark Star, the infamous fairy who was more a plague than anything else to the magical community. It had been quite a while since anyone had caught her long enough to hold an actual conversation. In fact, some of the folk thought she wasn't even real, just the fairy version of a boogeyman, a scapegoat for things gone wrong that no one could explain. The High King had issued a statement only days ago naming the Dark Star a suspect in the string of Ironborn murders. It had raised a lot of doubt, both in the High King's sanity by placing the blame on some wild poltergeist of their imagination, and in his famed nerve. But Arlo had just witnessed with her own eyes a little girl die because of something this girl in front of her had done. Was Cassandra Ironborn? Arlo hadn't thought to check her aura, but if this was the Dark Star and she was responsible for all the other Ironborn deaths... It's you, Arlo cringed away. It's me. Something a lot like triumph flickered across the girl's face, but it wasn't quick enough to mask the disappointment that showed there first. Arlo had no idea what that meant. She didn't care. You're coming with me. Wherever all this boldness came from, Arlo wasn't going to argue. Perhaps it was a side effect of her relief over her weight. Perhaps it was the disconcertion of witnessing someone's death, but Arlo snatched up the Dark Star's arm once more and turned to march back down the street. What are you doing? Perhaps the Dark Star was just as shocked as by Arlo's boldness. The girl stumbled along behind her, putting up no fight. Hey, Red, what's the shit? I'm taking you back to the palace. No thanks. I didn't ask if you wanted to. Okay, Miss Sassy Pants, we walking the whole way then? This was a very good question that only served to make Arlo more irritated. This girl, whether or not she was the genuine Dark Star, had no appreciation for the situation she was in, or apparent remorse for what she'd potentially just done. Yes, Arlo gritted out. Huh, you're really not afraid of me, are you? You know, this is the first time I've ever been arrested by a pretty young maiden in such fury. I like that. Want to get coffee after this? At a different cafe, of course. That last one was sort of a buzzkill. Are you kidding me? Arlo stopped and whirled around. A little girl just died. She's dead. In front of us. In front of her parents. She's gone. And you're making jokes? Arlo was shouting now. Pedestrians practically ran by them to avoid winding up a part of the scene. The girl in black looked back at Arlo in pure astonishment. Arlo had a hard time believing no one had ever yelled her down before, so that couldn't be the reason for it. It wasn't me. The words were spoken so softly, too much like the teen this girl looked to be underneath all her swagger. Young and lost, and at the moment slightly terrified. To be the monster everyone accused her of being. A bit of Arlo's anger relented, seeing this. You can tell that to the High King, then. Yeah, no, hard pass on that. The moment of sincerity was gone, swept away by returning bravado. The girl in black collected herself, and before Arlo could stop her, she tore her arm easily out of Arlo's hold. Wait, get back here. Arlo, what the hell do you think you're doing, running off like that? Rory latched onto his daughter, spinning her to face him. It was all the distraction the girl in black needed to escape, to hurry back up the street and disappear into the crowd. That was fine. She could run. Too bad for her that Arlo had something better than a description of her face to track her down. The Dark Star. The girl in black was gone, but she wasn't getting away. Whether or not she was who she claimed, that tattoo on her neck would only make her easier to find. The girl had answers. Unfortunately for whatever devious plot this Dark Star made herself a part of, Arlo was going to ensure it wouldn't stay secret for long. A year had passed since Hero had first met the acid-eyed hunter. The seal on his magic had been lifted, and his memory of the magical community restored. A feeling much like waking from a dream and stepping into cold reality, but regaining these had been unpleasant. Okay, so there was just like a weird break in the page. And now we're back to Hero, I guess. It had taken months for Hero's illness to subside. His stutter, his forgetfulness, his headaches, and sleepless nights, and soul-weary fatigue. These things had only gotten worse before they got better. His body had needed time to readjust to the sudden reorganization in his brain. The reversal of the High Council's violation hit him like an angry storm. His power a living thing, extremely displeased with his confinement and intent on making this known. And then he was fine. As though he'd never known this hardship at all, Hero felt like himself again. Of course, there had come a toll. Without his knowledge, his leaving home had been nothing more to his memory than a dramatic affair of his mother tossing him out, and Hero had been all too happy to leave. The squalor they lived in, his 6 younger siblings, who were often left to Hiro's care, his mother rarely home, and his alcoholic father only coming around between girlfriends. None of this had ever given him any joy. His knowledge returned. He now remembered the event as his mother wanting him gone because letting him stay would mean too much work on her part. She would have had to keep her other children from showing their magic in front of him, as was the rule in these cases. Not to mention she no longer received a child bonus check from the courts, now that he was 18 and no longer of magical status. Hiro's use to his mother had completely run out, and remembering exactly why, that it all boiled down to value, that his own mother had deemed him worthless to her, had hurt. But it was no matter. Hiro had now what was more important. All of the pieces that made him him. And no idea what the acid-eyed hunter wanted for giving this back. Malachite, dear man, what on earth has brought you all the way out to Nevada? The voice that had spoken snapped Hiro from his thoughts and struck something inside him. A memory he'd yet to reacquaint himself with. He looked up from his cappuccino and out across the small cafe, where he worked, and immediately pinned the source as a man. Unquestionably Faye, though glamoured, who'd just come through the door. Tall and lithe, but visibly strong, ivory fair and handsome, outfitted in an expensive suit so dark and emerald it verged on black. His magic only barely stretched to cover the points of his ears and the flesh of blue beneath his skin, and he had a way of moving that said he thought incredibly well of himself. A wealthy fae, then, and one with power. Briar Sylvain, exclaimed another glamoured fae with a chuckle. I could ask the same of you. This was obviously Malachite, just as tall as Briar Sylvain and a little stronger, and skin tanned sunny brown and eyes of jade so bright they had to be the result of magic. Beautiful, poised, and a twilight glow about him, this one was royal, if Hiro remembered correctly what that glowing actually meant. They embraced, and Hiro's head started to ache as he struggled to recall a memory. Briar Sylvain. He knew that name. Out here on business, then? Malachite grinned. A tracker never sleeps, you know that. You as well? Briar took a seat at his friend's table, soothing out the creases the action put in his pants. Yes, a counselor doesn't sleep either. It's the time of year we make our rounds to the academies and check on progress. You know, I'm surprised to find you all the way out here. Didn't your sister just give birth to a baby girl? What was her name again? Arlo. Malachite pulled a face. Arlo Jarstel. What an ugly name. An ugly iron name for ugly iron blood. She's no family of mine, so I don't see the cause for celebration. Yes, I agree. Quite a sin, in my opinion, that the old families should start to rust at all. Best to keep yourself removed from that sort of shame. At least she wasn't given the Viridian name. He shook his head, as though that would be the worst offense of all. Not to worry, when her weighing comes, I'll do everything in my power to ensure that stain is removed. The Ironborn. They should all be cast out, in my opinion. Why, just the other day. The man's voice was drowned out by a ringing, which Hiro realized blatantly only he could hear. He remembered now. Briar Sylvain, the steely representative of spring from their court in England, whose vote had been against 18-year-old Hiro at his weighing when he stood before the High Council in control of his future. Hiro felt the lip curl over itself in the beginnings of a sneer. Briar Sylvain, who, much like his mother, had looked down on him and judged him. Revolting, aren't they? A new voice said in his ear. Hiro nearly spilled coffee down his front. The acid-eyed hunter had a way of appearing out of nowhere. How do you keep doing that? He sputtered. The hunter's grin reminded Hiro of a shark. I've been here all this time. A hunter's glamour is special. I can render myself completely invisible at will. In fact, at the moment, no one can see me or hear me but you. Wonderful, Hiro muttered. At least I'm used to people thinking I'm insane. His gaze wandered back to the counselor and his friend. They think they're so much better than everyone else. Hilarious, isn't it? If only they knew what little Arlo Jarsdale will someday be capable of. What makes her so special? Hiro snapped, and then winced. He hadn't meant his words to sound so demanding of his savior and, more importantly, the first friend he'd had in some time. But for some reason this only made the hunter's grin deepen. I wonder which is greater in you. Your avarice? Avarice? Or your jealousy? I didn't mean... Forget the girl. I'd rather talk about what makes you so special, Hero. What makes you so much better than Fae like Briar Sylvain and Malachite Viridian Verdell? Yes, Hero would rather talk about that too. What sets them apart from you, do you think? What makes them think they're better? Wealth? Hero's reply was immediate, sour, almost before he could think what to say. It made the hunter creak out a laugh. Oh? Power, favor, beauty, wealth is more than money, but they're certainly got that too. They're worth more, and so they are more. Avarice it is, then. Hero looked at the hunter. This stunning individual. He was worth more too. What would it be like to stand beside him as an equal? To be more than some charity case, but a partner. What would it be like if Hero could become someone the hunter found attractive, the way Hero found him? Oh? Hero's got the hots for the hunter? Menna! Hey, Menna! If he could become more like Briar Sylvain, well-dressed and well-liked, wealthy in both appearance and air. As if reading his mind, the hunter smiled fondly. If only there was a way for you to be more too, to give you all the riches in the world, to fund your intelligence, your experiments, your legend, my hero. Hello, Minna, how are you? My hero, he shivered. He liked when the hunter called him this. And he knew the hunter well enough by now to read the proposition in the statement. Hero looked at Briar Sylvain. He looked at Malachite. Then he looked back at the hunter, whose name he hadn't earned yet, but was determined he one day would, and repeated what he told him upon their first meeting. I'm listening. Yeah, that's what we're doing. We're just chilling. Reading. That was the end of chapter 5, so we're about to start chapter 6. As soon as I stretch, because my back is killing me. Yo, pasta and Sudoku? I want to join K-chan. I love Sudoku and pasta. Also what, Minna? Cool, you're going go-karting? Yo, you're gonna get paid for it? Shit, I wish I could get paid to go go-karting instead of work. Thank you, Minna. That's my chibi form. Very stylish, very wow. Yes. Alright, we're on chapter 6 now, which is in Nausicaa's POV. Nausicaa, I think is how it's supposed to be pronounced. All Nausicaa had wanted was the deity's damned coffee. It had been a long day of poking random fairies for gossip, hoping to learn as much about the area as possible. She hadn't been in unseelie spring territory for quite some time, not since it had been in Europe, under the previous sovereign's rule. But the Viridians had done an impressive job of maintaining their claim on the season. There were quite a few royal fae families after all, none of which got on all that well, and it wasn't uncommon for courts to change hands as well as geographical locations. Though the Viridians had only settled in this portion of the world a little over a century ago, that they had managed to keep Unseelie Spring under their control since its founding was no small feat. No other family could boast such an impressive accomplishment, and as a result, the magic that followed Unseelie Spring was uncommonly powerful. But so too were its folk, and it was this that Nausicaa was currently stuck on. She shouldn't exist. What the shit is going on in this court? Nausicaa stopped in her tracks, ignoring the disgruntled cries of the people behind her on the sidewalk. Red. When Nausicaa had first spotted her in that cafe, she thought for a moment she was staring at Tisiphone. It was all that red hair, though Tisiphone's had been the color of precious coral, not fire. It was those bright green eyes, though Tisiphone's had been like the sea, not jade. It was the power at her core, though Tisiphone's had been shaped from water, not wind, as what billowed inside Red. All that power was building like a storm that would one day break free of its confines, and if Red survived that, the mortal realm would never know what hit it, because that girl, Nausicaa, had sensed it immediately. Fate had gone and assembled a mortal with immortal magic. Yo, what? Arlo has immortal magic? I don't know what that means, but... When immortals were destroyed, they didn't go back into the same star pool that fate used to mold her mortal children. Their pool was kept separate, because the stuff that made immortals was much too strong and wreaked havoc on the mortal mind, body, and soul alike that wasn't born of divine parentage. Did Red have an immortal parent? Unlikely. The immortals were no longer permitted here to make that possible. The Furies and the Wild Hunt, and a handful of similar others in various parts of the world, were allowed to perform their jobs in this realm, and the heads of the courts could extend temporary invitation to any immortal who consented to such a meeting, but that immortal couldn't go further than the designated meeting grounds. Oh, the immortals was what Nausicaa was before she was made not immortal or whatever and sent to Earth. So that's interesting. Besides, Red was distinctly Ironborn. Nausicaa had sensed that in her magic too. The Titan Fate had been known to do this once in a while, though she hadn't since the immortals banished from this realm. She'd take a mortal, spruce them up with a bit of otherworldly magic, and throw them into the mix, for the other deities to fight over like a cruel game of capture the flag. So much of the deities' powers depended on worship. Once upon a time, they'd lain with mortals to produce offspring, demigods as both folk and humans called them, to help spread the word of their grandeur and superiority over the other deities and garner favor. Now, though, humans had forgotten the old gods completely, with the folk only worshipping a select few, and only when convenient for them. Immortal powers had waned considerably in and passing centuries. People like Red were wild cards, up for anyone to grab for their own. Once Red matured, once she came into her powers, the deities would swarm, clawing at one another to figure out how to win her to their side, and they'd find a way to circumvent the treaty holding them back to do so. No one in the mortal realm truly appreciated just how starved the immortals were for their powers to be restored, for the worship that would make them strong again and allow them to break the bonds of the treaty altogether in return. Red would give them an advantage they desperately craved. So fate had to be behind this, but why? Nausicaa could make all kinds of guesses, but she really couldn't say. She'd never really understood the minds of her elders, and hadn't been privy to their plans for some time. The Titans of the West, fate, luck, hope, ruin, chaos, nature, and time. These beings played by their own set of rules. All the best of luck to Red, if she was one of their pawns too. It wasn't any of Nausicaa's business. She tried to ignore her. Easily done at first. The focus of her original curiosity had gone and died, and she was definitely Ironborn too, judging by that glow inside her veins and the faint magical aura clinging to her mother. The Reaper had to have been nearby. It had clearly been sent to clean up the tracks behind whoever was really responsible here. Nausicaa hadn't been able to sense it, but she knew if she did a bit of poking around, she might be able to find what waited in the offing, biding its time to strike. Then once again there was Red, chasing Nausicaa down, all blustering fury, and Nausicaa couldn't help but pause, couldn't help but interact, any more than fire could help the wind that blew it hotter. Remember our deal. You'll know when you meet them. You'll help. I'll take you. Fuck that. Nausicaa blew out her cheeks and propelled herself forward once more. Red wasn't who she was meant to help. Nausicaa refused, just as she refused to linger any longer on what had happened. Now, if I was a giant-ass death monster, where would I be hiding? More and more of late, Nausicaa wondered if the Titan Luck was growing bored with peace just the same as fate apparently had, because almost in answer to this question, a chorus of screaming grabbed her attention. She stopped once more, eyes grown wide, head whipping to her left. Toronto's iconic CN Tower loomed directly above her, and at its base sat Ripley's Aquarium of Canada, currently echoing with the terrified cries of humans. Huh, Nausicaa said, an important connection clicking into place. The courts had driven the reefers so far from their territories that these creatures had taken to hiding in the world's deepest cracks and caverns. They'd been gone so long from society that a city like this, with all its people and cars and contraptions, lights and sounds, had to be overwhelming to it. The reaper that Nausicaa hunted, it was very possible it had been found in some lonely grotto or cave by the sea, where everything was calm and damp and cool. And now that it was so far from where it lived, it was also very possibly homesick. And coming across an aquarium would be like finding a desert oasis. Nausicaa didn't even get the chance to decide if she was going to stop the reaper or help it. A monstrous shriek rent the air, much less triumphant than it had sounded back in Darrington, and the aquarium's front doors burst open, spewing out a horde of people. Moments later came a shattering of windows, followed by a tidal wave of water and fish and sea creatures. Nausicaa threw her arms in front of her face and turned to brace herself against the sudden surge, but just as it hit, she was whisked away, away from the wave, away from the reaper, away from the aquarium. As quickly as she realized someone had teleported her, it was over. When Nausicaa opened her eyes, she found herself drenched in the middle of a cemetery. Oh, there's gonna be an ad in like 30 seconds. St. James Cemetery, to be exact, the oldest still in operation in Toronto. It was a stone's throw away from the Spring Palace and consisted of the usual things one might find in a graveyard: old and drooping oak trees, mossy headstones, crumbling monuments, weathered marble mausoleums, and a handful of slough masquerading as crows, all contained within a flaking, rusted wrought iron fence, a superstition developed by humans, back when belief in such things was stronger, to protect them from restless spirits. The day allowed for human traffic, but once night fell, it turned into a thriving fairy hotspot, despite the metal that should have deterred them. At the moment it was empty of both, save the slough. Hello, Nausicaa. Airy, lilting words spilled damp and cool down Nausicaa's neck. She shuddered and darted instantly away. Her katana assembled itself from a burst of soot, black smoke in her hand. When enough space existed between her and the person who'd brought her here, she whipped around. There were very few in this realm who could successfully sneak up on her, and it was her very worst luck that across from her stood the one she could honestly say she wished least to encounter. Leth? I'm guessing is their name? The tall, slip-thin immortal was built a bit like driftwood, a little warped and oddly angled. Everything about him seemed too long and far too narrow. His pale skin possessed a silvery quality that gleamed pearlescent at certain angles, and the freckles splashed across his nose were as white as pricks of starlight. Together with his antifreeze green eyes and the dark metallic gray of his hair, shaved to stubble on one side of his head, and wildly tangled around braids and bits of forest debris on the other, he was the very image of dangerous magic. Unfortunately, that image was correct. Even by Nausicaa's standards, and despite the strict laws that governed his stay in this realm, stay, not banishment, as what kept Nausicaa here herself, Leth was easily the most dangerous thing this realm possessed. Should she spark his mercurial temper, there was very little love between them, and she could call on for protection. Oh, Minna's an agile. I guess we'll wait for the ad to be over. I like how when I have to scratch my nose and cover my mouth, it just makes my mouth start doing all sorts of weird shit. Okay, K-chan. I posture checked and drank water. Okay, Minna. Are you back, Minna? Are you out of ad jail? I don't remember where it was. It is still Nausicaa, right? It's been so long since we've seen each other that you might have changed it without me knowing. Leth's owl-wide eyes looked over her in a flick. Stars, but you make an ugly mortal. What do you want, Leth? She'd been intentionally avoiding Leth and the three others who kept his company. All this time, she'd managed to get by without running into him, and he'd clearly not wanted to seek her out himself, so she doubted this decision offended him. But it was better to keep this conversation moving. There was no telling what would set Leth off, and Nausicaa wasn't exactly known for keeping her cool either. Welcome back, Minna. What do I want? He lifted a leather boot to the stone bench between them and leaned against his knee. Neither his boots nor his tight-fitted trousers were all that exciting, as black as the ones Nausicaa wore, but his obsidian, high-collared tunic boasted an elaborate, lethal web of silver fastenings, buckles, and chains that was much more his usual style when out of uniform. We're family, are we not, dear cousin? You come all this way after so long absent, and I don't even get a hug? I would rather hug a reaper, no offense. Leth chuckled, a sound like splintering wood. The long fingers of his left hand drummed against his knee, causing the deadly adamantine claws that caped them to glint in shards of light. Interesting choice of words. A reaper, Funny you should bring that up. Nausicaa stiffened. You know something. Ah, Nausicaa. I know many somethings. I'm very old, and the stars are privy to so many secrets. You'll have to be a little more specific. Fine, asshole. You know that there's a reaper here, in this city, in your keeper's court, in that aquarium you so rudely stole me away from before I could check it out, so thanks for that, by the way. You know there's a reaper out there either cleaning up after some other asshole or capitalizing on their extra-level villainy, using alchemy and iron-born children to whip up their very own. Stars, I know all that. Leth raised his right hand, free of the claws on his left, to trace a finger down the acute edge of his jaw. What a wild imagination you have. But then, you've always been this way. The stiffness in Nausicaa's voice had nothing to do with her weariness now, or unease. Excuse me? Leth grinned deeply for a taunting second, revealing a mouth crammed full of sharp teeth. Then abruptly his face rearranged into exaggerated sincerity. Yes, you've always been quite good at spinning tales, at thinking with your passions instead of your head. I almost envy that. I invite you to shut the fuck up. She knew where this was going. It was nothing she hadn't heard before, numerous times and numerous versions, but invariably it was the same story. Tisiphone. She'd suffered for so long from chronic depression. It wasn't surprising, given their line of work, being the ones to deal with the very worst that the very worst people could inflict. It wasn't surprising, given how competitive and vicious immortals could be to one another. Tisiphone had been a gentle soul, had never been able to look at suffering with indifference, and this way of life had eaten at her mental health. But immortals were proud. They didn't talk about things like this because they liked to believe things like this just didn't happen to them. Nausicaa had had no idea how to relate to this part of her sister, how to keep from making things worse instead of better. Hell's what her sister's illness was even called, and Tisiphone, desperate for help, had fallen in with an abhorrent mortal fae. Helfrine? He pretended to be so sympathetic to her problems, so in love with her, so loyal, only to make her into the latest of his conquest, to use her and discard her when he'd gotten what he'd wanted, and it had been the last of what Tisiphone could bear. Oh shit. Always the stories that spread about them were Alecto, painted like some tragic hero, driven to madness by grief and convinced of blame where blame wasn't due because immortals never liked admitting a mortal could ever affect them at all, let alone so deeply. In their opinion, it was really Tisiphone to blame for the way things turned out. Her they painted as the victim of her own dramatics, as though her self-inflicted destruction, her death by suicide, was some shameful failing on her own part. Always these stories attributed Alecto's rage to overreaction, and always it made her stomach turn. Like I said, I almost envy you, but then I remember how dreadfully pathetic it was to watch Megara pull you from that burning ship. Pathetic, to see something so magnificent fall to something as petty as grief, and after everything Eris did for you. Nausicaa shivered. She tried to focus on her breathing, the way she'd learned in the few therapy sessions she'd managed to talk herself into attending. Inhale deeply, hold. Exhale deeply, hold. In and hold again. Led's words were only that. She couldn't let their sparks catch on the tinder setting in place of her heart. And look at you now. In and hold. Out and hold. Your fire's gone dim. Your threadbare rags of your former glory. You reek of iron. If I can be completely honest, it embarrasses me to call you family. So don't, she growled. In and hold, out and hold, in and hold again. It wasn't working. Her shivering grew into tremors. Her hands began to shake with the fury Leth knew full well he stirred. Already thrown off by the events in the cafe, by Red, by the aquarium, it wouldn't take much for Nausicaa to lose herself to the rage now yawning in her chest, lifting its head to scent the air. She angled the point of her katana at Led's heart. A gorgeous assembly of glittering black glass and steel as dark as a void, and curled her lip in a silent snarl. I'm not going to tell you to shut up again. It's your fault too, you know, Tisiphone's death. You torched some insignificant mortal all because he dared to be the latest in your sister's oh so many woes, and you got all hot and bothered at the other immortals for spurning the idea that one of their own could suffer human illnesses. But remind me again, what did you do to help where the others didn't? In fact, I distinctly recall you. Nausicaa's rage exploded. She lunged and struck, and struck, and struck at the gleefully laughing immortal, as he dodged and dodged and dodged every blow. Darkness ate away at her vision the way heat ate away at film. Every failed swing built strength for the next, though none of them landed. They forced Leth back step by step until he was pinned against a tall burgundy headstone. Nausicaa lifted her katana high above her head. With all the savage might she could muster, she brought it down. He caught it without a flinch. The black glass blade wedged firmly into his claw-tipped hand, and sapphire blue welled up around it to trickle down his arm, but he was otherwise unharmed. He was also apparently tired of this game. His laughter fell flat, with a strength only few could manage. He took advantage of Nausicaa's frustration to wrest her katana clean from her grip and toss it aside. The sword burst back into the same black smoke that called it into this realm and disappeared. At the very same instant, he gripped her by the back of her neck and hurled her into the headstone he had been pinned against. "Urgh," she cried. The wind knocked from her chest. Leth held her, bent over the granite stone with all his weight on her back. No matter how she struggled, or screamed, or snarled at him, she couldn't break free. His strength was greater than her own, backed by the full force of his undiminished magic. Her body still trembled with residual anger and adrenaline. Even her teeth chattered with it. When she aimed to kick back at his shin, he blocked it too easily and kicked back at her just as hard. "Enough," he hissed into her ear. "Up yours," Nausicaa gritted out, but despite herself began to settle. Lev chuckled another round of splintering wood. "It's nice to see you still have some fight. You're going to need that, cousin. Whatever I do or don't know about what's going on, my hands are tied, but others are not. I hear you're looking for the fairy ring." Known far and wide as the Court of Exiles, a tongue-in-cheek name for the sort of clientele it served, the fairy ring would be the perfect place to harvest information about rogue reapers and nefarious plots. Yes, Nausicaa had been looking for it. The problem was, no one could agree on where it was, if they even had a guess at all. She'd followed directions to multiple locations, none of them correct, and after several hours of trekking her way around Toronto, all she wanted from the rest of her day had been to sit in the Good Vibes Only cafe and eat her sandwich and drink her coffee in peace. "I despise you," Nausicaa said with great vehemence. "We could have had a normal fucking conversation about this. You didn't have to fucking bait me like..." "How boring." She grunted her teeth. "You're an asshole. You haven't changed a bit." "Yes, I'm looking for the fairy ring. You know where I can find it then?" In response to this question, Leth released his grip from her neck. He eased his weight off her back and slid far enough away for her to straighten and gingerly work the kinks from her muscles. "Well?" she glared at him. Leth's grin blew uncomfortably wide. "Yes, the masturbator." Oops, I hit the microphone. Well, that was the end of chapter 6. Definitely some interesting things starting to happen. My nose is so itchy. Alright, so that's gonna be it for reading today. Let me see who's online to raid. Nope-de-dopes is live. You're welcome, K-Chan. We're gonna raid Nope-de-dopes. Menna, I have another sibling who plays chess. And that's who we're gonna raid. Yeah, good job, K-Chan. You did it. I was just about to either do that or tell you to do that. K-Chan's such a good mod. I do have work tomorrow, so tomorrow's stream's gonna be at 8. Hopefully, as long as I get out of work on time. If not, then I guess it'll be later. Oh, hi Hadel. Hi, we're about to raid. Yeah. Thanks for stopping in, though. We're gonna go raid Nopety Dopes. Yeah, also I don't remember if I thanked you for the donation, Keishon. I completely forgot if I did or not. But bye!